Other thing which I want to say, that there is no right answer. We're trying to find a right answer, which again and again I would like to emphasize, for different children, for different schools, for different contexts, the answers are different. And if you try and find a one-size-fits-all solution, we are just going to fall flat on our faces. And talking about people who have forcefully, who got pushed out of their country. They didn't leave. They were not, Tibetans are not dropouts of Tibet, right? They were pushed out of Tibet. So if they were pushed out of Tibet, then what is it that we can do while they're here and waiting to go back for whatever reason, to make sure that when they do go back, they go back in a position of strength, both as people of the world and as Tibetans. Firstly as Tibetans, and then depending again who you are. So if you're living in Canada, your ease with which you speak the language of where you live actually will put you in a disadvantage. But if you are not comfortable with who you are, then, and that comes from the culture part of it, which is again language dominated in many ways. If you're not comfortable with what you are, who you are, then no matter where you live, so if you're not comfortable being a Tibetan, right, because you don't understand what it means to be a Tibetan, then even if you're very good at the language, just the pure language, the technical language, it's not going to make that difference. And therefore what he said, I was very happy to hear him say that it has to go beyond the classroom. Where language cannot be something that is limited to the classroom. It has to bring the world into the classroom. And that will make the language richer. Just to quickly talk in terms about, my family came away from Pakistan at the time of partition. We didn't want to leave, we got pushed out in the same way. But what happened, there was a closure. At some point in time, there was a closure, this was it. We were never going to go back. That closure is not there for Tibet. So that closure is important to keep it open. And last night when you saw the show, the cultural show, I mean, what a powerful evening that was. And the thing is, a lot of the people, young Tibetans, and I work with some young Tibetans, I quickly had a word with them this morning, and there's 23 of them. They haven't seen those kind of shows. And that really surprised me, that when you're expecting them to fight for Tibet, that's Tibet. That's the culture that you're trying to hang on to, and that's what you're not only preserving, and like you said, it has to be a dynamic culture. So we need to make sure that the Tibetans themselves are part of this culture, and a growing evolutionary culture, so that it has a space for itself, whether you go back in 5 years or you go back in 50 years, but while you're waiting to go back, it's a live Tibet. And that can only happen with language and culture. I could go on, so I'm going to just stop here for a while, just by talking about some of the stuff that we do with music and drama, and what, when Professor talked about music. I mean, it's the most powerful natural force. And you combine that with theater, then you have a killer app as it's called these days. So a lot of the kids that we work with, and I work a lot with children who do not know either English or do not know either Hindi or whatever it is, we get them to perform a musical in the language that they do not know. First of all, we make them write the script. Then we get them to compose the music. So they own the whole thing. It takes 5 to 6 months of a lot of hard work for this to come together. So they have to understand the words, because writing a song is very different from writing an essay. And then getting it to music so that you have to change the words so they rhyme is another thing. For me, another crucial situation is poetry. If you understand poetry, that's the best way to understand a language. If you write poetry, you recite poetry, you appreciate poetry, it is another different dimension. Just a few paragraphs they speak so eloquently. They put forward thoughts in a way that very few other forms of language come around. And I'll end with one little example of some experiences. Every year, we happen to organize a train journey, which starts at Delhi and goes to Varanasi, goes to Bodh Gaya, goes all over the place. And the passengers are Tibetans, Indians, Thai, and some Bhutanese. Most of them are children who have not finished school or have just had smattering of school. And they definitely do not know each other's language. But when they come back 3 weeks later, it's a whole different experience. And their bonding has happened. They have created a new language, which is much more powerful than the mother tongue, because they are the mothers of this tongue, in a way. And then when they sit down and use this new language to take forward difficult concepts that exist, I mean, that is an experience to go through. So the coming together of different languages, the coming together of the need to learn, I think once you kind of kindle the hunger for knowledge, the rest kind of follows. And of course, there's also the last, sorry, my many lasts. As you know, my English is very bad. My maths is really, really bad. There is a school in Delhi which I think you should have a look at. It's called the Sardar Patel Vidyalaya. It does a fantastic job of just this. Up till class 6, from nursery to class 6, everything is taught in Hindi. Everything. Whether it is environmental studies, music, art, physical fitness, when you go to the PF, everything is in public speaking, outings, everything's in Hindi. And then English is introduced as a subject in grade 1, just as a subject, slowly learn your ABC, that kind of stuff. Then class 5 is a very important subject, transition period. It's a bridge between junior school and senior school. And then maths and science start, because it's using, the difficulty is because till then you have used the Hindi numerals. And then suddenly you start using the English numerals for maths. They start from that. Maths first, and then halfway through a little bit of science, but social studies and everything else continues in Hindi. Then in class 6 and 7, slowly they move from Hindi to English. And by the time they reached class 10, and you see there, if you want to look at an indicator of success, their exam results, which is just one indicator of success. They're at top of the pops. And years later, you speak to any kid from the Sardar Patel Vidyalaya, their Hindi is very strong, because in those first years, they think in Hindi. And that's what makes it different. And the thing is that for a lot of kids, Hindi is not their mother tongue. It's a Gujarati school. It's not, the whole idea of mother tongue in Delhi becomes a joke, because in the school that I work, whose mother tongue do I deal with? I've got people from Karnataka, I've got people from Punjab, Haryana, UP, Bihar, Bengal. I mean, whose mother tongue am I going to use? So if I'm going to use some sort of a executive power like you used in the beginning of your, to decide that Hindi is the mother tongue, or whatever the case may be, it becomes the mother tongue, because that's what you're living in and you're doing. So therefore, this Gujarati school, run by the Gujarati Society, took a really bold decision, not now, many, many years ago, and has stuck by it, and it's a great success. So I would suggest that you have a look at the Sardar Patel methodology. And I think the kids come out of them really, culturally very strong. And they have a very strong mix of both Hindi and English. And the third language, then they can choose whichever one that they want to, whether it's Gujarati or Bengali, as CBSE asks them to do. Last one. Promise you. Again, last one. This whole experience of how do you mix a language without losing out, and how do you use language as a enabler? And how do you stop language being a disenabler? if there is such a word. And both of them aspects are very powerful. Does your lack of Hindi disenable you? Because it did for me. It took away from me a large body of original literature, which I read in translation, and I would have loved to have read it in its original. Because the school that I went to didn't, it was a Jesuit school, it didn't really give me that opportunity. And therefore, this idea of doing two languages, your ability to learn in Tibet till grade 5 or 6, and then bring in the English, opens up both worlds for you. Why do we want to close either world, right? Why should one be exclusive, an exclusion factor? They should be both inclusive factors. So your knowledge of Tibetan should give rise to great literature in Tibetan and rise to great literature in English from a Tibetan perspective. And your facility with the English should be able to bring a great literature, again, or poetry, or music, or dance into the language. So I think I really don't have very big words, and I couldn't spell them in any case because of my ability not. And the other thing is the tweeting that's happened now. Is this Tibetan script? Tibetan script is available on smartphones, right? And the ease with which the youngsters use Tibetan, and they're developing their own language, and that should be seen also as a progression, rather than something that is taking away from the sanctity of language. It's an evolution. And when they use the smartphone, they use Twitter in Tibetan, they're forced to think in 140 characters. They are Pressy writing that Professor Krishna Kumar talked about. The Twitter forces you to say something very strong in 140 characters. I think those things also should be used and talked about as facilitators to take language forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arunji. Now we move to Professor Farquhan Kamarji.
I do not think that I can add more value than had already been given. So if Arun Kapoorji or anybody else wants to have more time, kindly. I would say only one thing. Maybe this is not the problem of Tibet, but this is more of a problem for us in India, that the language, and everybody agrees that the teaching in the mother tongue makes children understand concept and comprehend much, much better than when they are taught in a foreign language. But when the language of the market, language of the job, language of the business is not the same as your mother tongue, then there is a dilemma. And that dilemma is largely with the children and their parents. And quite often, we find ourselves that with all these evidences that the educationists provide, we somehow fail to convince and communicate to the population that you can learn better and be more successful in your life in whatever way you want to define your life. If you do that, they prefer to go for that foreign language. So if it's an issue relevant to you, I think there has to be some thinking about it. Present situation, of course, the language of business and language of job and language of market for the Tibetan is certainly different than their mother tongue. Maybe after you are back in Tibet, maybe things would be different. So I think there has to be some thinking about it. Second thing, and see, there is a mother tongue, but there is a tongue language which children and people speak. And they might be using the grammar of the mother tongue, but the vocabulary and so many other things may be from the foreign language. And that also creates some kind of a learning problems. For example, one anecdote which I share, and I think you may be able to appreciate, somebody arrives at Varanasi railway station wants to go to BHU, and the BHU's name, official name is Kashi Hindu Vishwavidyalaya. And the person asks one rickshaw puller that, can you take me to Kashi Hindu Vishwavidyalaya? And the person says, okay, no, I don't know. But then at the same time, there are so many people who wants to help him. And to everyone, he's saying Kashi Hindu Vishwavidyalaya, and nobody is able to help him. And then finally, when the 20 people are around, then he says, okay, I want to go to BHU. And the person said, then why were you speaking English so far? So a Hindi-speaking belt, where most of the people who were wanting to help him were at least 8th, 9th, 10th class passed in a Hindi medium, but Kashi Hindu Vishwavidyalaya was English to them, and BHU was Hindi to them. This is a problem these days we are facing. Thirdly, I mean, but maybe it is not as much at the primary and elementary school level, but at higher level, we are experiencing one problem, that those who have studied in a vernacular medium, in a local language medium or in a mother tongue, we often find that their whole reading is also limited, because the literature as such is not as much available to them in their mother tongue, and therefore their whole reading and the whole understanding of whatever discipline and subject is so limited that they often do not compete with the person who's had the opportunity of pursuing his or her studies in that language of the market where the literatures are available in plenty. So how to reconcile? So I think any attempt to have this mother tongue, I think, should be equally strongly supported by production of literature, not only of the textbook and the supplementary readings, but also plenty of other literature, not only in the area of language and culture and literature, but also around the scientific and the technological areas. So thank you very much.
Almost done. And now we're going to move on to the next part of the session, session number 2. And before we move on to the next session, I would really like to express my heartfelt thanks for your very active participation in the deliberation on those very important issues. And I would say for sure this morning's discussions have been very, very fruitful, really wonderful suggestions. And, the next session actually centers on suggestions, recommendations that would help improve, language in education. So for this last session, since we are, we don't have enough time, I would really like to ask the group to volunteer rather than, going to this kind of a round robin or something of that kind. So I would really appreciate if you could just volunteer and share your suggestions.
Listening, reading, and speaking, and the writing is extremely important to, to express one's own thoughts and expressions and feelings. And the students should be, trained in writing their, in putting down their thoughts in black and white. And for that, I think they may not necessarily be asked to write on certain formal topics like honesty is the best policy and things like that. Rather, they may be exposed, or some movies may be shown to them, or they can be taken to a trekking, or they can be taken to visit a museum or some places, and after returning from these places, or exposing to such a event, then they may be asked to write down and put down their thoughts and feelings on black and white, and that really helps a lot. And sometimes the students jot down their, narrate the whole thing, and at the end they write in, poems, in beautiful poems, So this kind of exercise would certainly be very, beneficial, as I was talking about, listening to different things, to radios, and they may be, they may be told to listen to BBC and CNN, and they may be asked to watch CNN and BBC televisions, and they may be exposed to some talk shows and things like that also. And in the similar manner, they may be exposed to regular English language channels, in India news channels and things like that. And then they of course should be provided good reading materials and given ample time for speak English language. And of course, while they are learning Tibetan language in the up to 5th level, they should always be speaking Tibetan language, and so that they may develop the Tibetan language in full sense. Besides that, I would like to mention a little bit about the vernacularization. This is a serious matter that we need to give a very serious thought about this, because of course it would be much better, much easier, much convenient to learn the subject matter, but we have to think about how we are going to, even if we are able to translate the texts of from 6 onward to 12th, and we need to provide the other materials, other literatures which are required to be read. So far as in English is concerned, there are so many other literatures in English for the science literature, science subjects and art subjects. Will we be able to provide to those materials? If we cannot provide those materials, those literature, and translate them into Tibetan and provide them, then they would be just confined to the textbooks, and that knowledge would be extremely limited. And even if we have been able to get it done up to 12th, then where these students will go for higher education? Right? Will we be able to, in Japan and other countries where they have developed the education system and, have started writing their, the writing in their own language, in Japanese language, on science and all other subjects, will we be able to do that? Because given the, limitation of population we have in India in exile, and all. Of course, we can correlate this in Tibet as well, but the situation is very different. So, if the students are not able to go to higher, education in having the certificates in Tibetan language, it would be extremely difficult for them to pursue their higher education in the respective fields. And even if hypothetically, if we are able to establish a university in which we can provide all these literatures and provide these, teach these subjects in Tibetan language, again, these most of the science, subjects are developing subjects, fast developing subjects, and every now and then the new text comes, new new materials comes, the new literatures come. So it is a fast developing, constantly developing kind of field of studies and field of knowledge. So will we be able to cope those things in a proper manner, in a satisfactory manner? So these are some of the things that we really need to think seriously. And I think in the beginning, if we give training in Tibetan language and let them develop a very sound ground of Tibetan language, and then besides that and after that, then I think if we give them training in English language, and at the same time we can provide some reading materials in Tibetan language and things like that, that would be beneficial for the students. And also and then another issue that is to be taken into account is what Professor Kamar has said about the demand in the market. Will the Tibetan students who have done their the BA and BSc and MSc in Tibetan language, where they would go? What would be the demand for them, right? So there are so many things to be taken into consideration. So we need to give a very serious thought about this. I don't disagree that these subjects should be taught in Tibetan language, but given the situation, we have to give a serious thought about this. Thank you.
Krishna Kumarji.
And a vast body of ideas has become available since this morning to reflect on and draw recommendations out of that vast body. I'm sure when the recordings are heard and analyzed, that will happen. I'm only drawing from this discussion one sort of point which appears to me to be worth being articulated as what I think should be a priority among recommendations that one might make. How teachers perceive this problem of language is going to be a crucial question for in-service programs, for the pre-service programs and so on, across the board. How teachers perceive it. Because no matter what the policy is, the teachers' understanding that language is ultimately a means of learning is crucial. Let's imagine a class 11 child who hasn't understood a concept that has been taught, let's say in physics or whatever subject, which has been taught in English because that's the medium of instruction. Now this child hasn't understood it and stands up, if the culture of the classroom permits, and says, "Ma'am, I couldn't make head or tail of it. Can you explain it?" Now the question here is, will the teacher feel free enough to explain the idea in Tibetan or in Hindi or whatever, or will the teacher feel constrained by the policy and act like an orthodox that, look, medium of instruction is English, and so no matter what this child is doing, I'll have to explain in English again. And she explains it. That's the question. Is the goal of language policy better understanding, or is the goal of the language policy to impose a bureaucratic constraint on what teachers can or cannot do? To what extent teachers understand that language is a medium of understanding? And so, yes, the priority is absolutely clear that a grade 12 child must be able to explain a concept in English, because we are preparing our children for a world in which English is a dominant language. Are we also giving to that child the capacity to translate in his own mind and then through his writing a concept that she has understood well because she has felt free enough to interact with teachers in her own language, and she has the capacity now to translate that concept into English in appropriate words that she has also picked up? This is really a question of flexibility in the system and common understanding. During these NCRT years, I used to literally insist, whenever I met principals of Kendriya Vidyalayas and Navodaya Vidyalayas and various other types of schools that we deal with, to say, fine, I'm glad that you are buying all our English medium textbooks, but please don't mind, take a set in Hindi also, put it in the class. Every classroom should have a set of our textbooks in Hindi as well as in Urdu. We publish in these three languages. I said no harm will be done, because when a child doesn't quite understand what's being said in English, there's no harm if he picks up the Hindi edition or the Urdu edition and looks at it. In fact, personally, I started gifting to English medium children a textbook of the same subject in Hindi if they came to my office, which happened quite often. I say, take this book there's the physics book you're studying in a nice English medium school, but take this physics book in Hindi, see how someday you might need it. And quite a few of them sometimes used to write to me saying that, I enjoy seeing how this same concept has been explained in Hindi, and so on. The key question is this flexibility of the mind, that the goal is understanding. The goal is not to be able to regurgitate what I have not understood, but regurgitate it in English. There's a very nice anecdote or a story which explains this idea in the biography of the American physicist Feynman, whose father was also a physicist. And Feynman has recalled in his autobiography how one day when he was very young. He was 5 years or 6 years of age, and he went for a morning walk with his father. And they noticed a bird which was very attractive and colorful. So this little boy asked his father, Papa, what's the name of this bird? And his father said, son, it doesn't matter what its name is, because it has different names. They call it by one name in Spanish, by another name in English, by another name in Portuguese. Observe how it flies. What happens to its wings when it flies? Observe its beak. Can you tell me what it looks like? It doesn't matter what its name is. Our problem is that we spend years and years trying to help children memorize names of things in English, names of concepts, names of processes, and don't pay enough attention to this joy of observing, of telling the teacher what they have observed, no matter in what language they tell that. So long as they know that this is the phenomena they have to understand, and then they have to report the phenomena in English, which is fine. English is very important. There is no question about it. And so I think maybe there is a need to revisit this policy that we will not touch English from grade 1 to 4, and then we will shift to English. Now, it's a difficult policy to follow. I think it's important for children to realize that several languages are there in this world, and two of which I'm learning. English can remain a second language. You can call it a kind of a side language from grade 1 to 4, but can start early as exposure to English, because there are so many ways to get exposed to English now, not just through textbooks. We can, of course, develop very good textbooks to accompany the growth of the Tibetan as a mother tongue in those years. You also have, I'm told, 10% or more children of Indian backgrounds in your schools. They will bring their own languages. And so the recommendation of the national curriculum framework that the environment of the class should be flexible, should be multilingual. A teacher should be capable of responding to children in the language which they best understand, without following this orthodoxy that I have to speak in the language which the government has asked me to speak, and no matter what I do. Because this is the phenomena we see in Indian schools all the way. The most tragic experience I had was in Bombay. There was a municipal school where the medium of instruction happened to be Hindi. Many of the children were from Marathi background, somewhere from various other backgrounds. City of Bombay is like that. And in that complex, the Bombay municipality had several schools. One in English medium, one Urdu medium, one Marathi medium, one Kannada medium, and so on. So this happened to be the Hindi medium school, which I was visiting. And this teacher, she was Marathi speaking, but had learnt very good Hindi. So I asked her hypothetically, I said, look, if a child stands up and asks you a question in Marathi, what will you do in your class? She said, no, I'll respond in Hindi. I said, why? Because my commissioner has told me that I can only use Hindi in these classes. I said, but you are inheritor of a great language called Marathi. This child is also a Marathi speaker. Why not explain the concept to this child in Marathi? She's looked at me. Beside me, standing was the commissioner himself. Now, since I was the director, I said, Commissioner साहब, इनको allow कर दीजिए, क्या हर्ज है? बोल लेंगी थोड़ा बहुत अपनी क्लास में. So he also wondered for a moment. He was an officer. He said, नहीं, director साहब कह रहे हैं तो बोल दीजिए. कोई बात नहीं, आप बोल सकती हैं. That feeling, teachers in our system get so restrained by orders, by instructions, and by policy statements. So if the policy is medium of instruction is English, that will happen. Medium instruction is Tibetan, that will happen. And nobody will worry about medium of understanding, which is what our goal really is. So I think policy has to be explained to teachers in this larger, flexible way, that our goal is to reach the child, to make the child feel comfortable. And then wonderful things will happen. They will be users of different languages. Certainly English is one of the easiest things to master in a world in which so much is happening in English. But the orthodoxy has to be kind of overcome. Thank you.
Because it's not that I know the solution, but I think we need to be attentive to what might happen. See, one thing is when we're introducing a language to a child at a later age, anything 6 or above, there is going to be a mismatch of sophistication. See, any piece of text has both content and language, and if the levels of sophistication of the child don't match either, it'll be a problem. I'll just give an example. When we have a Hindi as a second language classes, it is very hard for us to find good material that an 11-year-old will enjoy reading but also be able to read. Yeah? The material for that age group which is suitable for his language acquisition is too babyish content wise. It's not sophisticated enough, yeah, because he or she can understand a lot, but it's baby material, babyish material. So that problem may happen with English, and I don't know how that will be fixed, in the sense that if you start later and later in English, then you have a 12-year-old Tibetan child who can grapple with issues, but the English books he's reading are not grappling with those. So that one problem of material. The other problem that may come up is of time. If you're going to study two languages at almost equal levels of intensity, how are we going to timetable this? I mean, we're always struggling with timetables, so I'm just wondering, realistically, finding enough periods within the day to do this meaningfully might become a problem. Then you might have to seek opportunities outside the classroom, and since you have residential schools, I think you have to convert more of that downtime into teaching time. Somehow it has to be done. And the third thing, I was just thinking that when a young person hits adolescence, again, this is now they're becoming mature, they're learning new vocabulary even in their main language, and if at this age they don't have the Tibetan in which to think about these new ideas and concepts, what will happen? I just wondering if we follow this model of initially Tibetan, then a in-between period, and then English. But when they hit adolescence, that's when they are beginning to learn so many new things about themselves and about life and about the world. And then they don't have the 5th standard Tibetan. Is it going to meet that need? I don't know. So these are just some.
The idea of the life that comes in the way when you become an adolescent, most of it happens outside the classroom. By which time, when they're 14 and 13 and 14, they have their own language, which might not necessarily be either of those languages. And they will grapple with these issues in their language and not necessarily in the formal learning language that's going on inside. And if by the time they reach there, they've had a good grounding of both Tibetan and English, their thought process will take them through that. Very often, these adolescent problems don't need to be written down in an essay form. They need to be verbalized to, in a worst case scenario, to a counselor, but in a best case scenario, thought through by themselves. So I think that's not going to be a real issue in those terms. But I think what the idea of the teacher being able to deal with the freedom, if the teacher is not the curriculum, then they have a whole bunch of other issues. So whether it's in language or it's in maths or whatever else, if there is such a strict bureaucratic control of the teaching methodology inside the classroom, then it's going to impair the teacher, whether it's a language class or the maths class or any other class. So this issue that Professor Krishna Kumar himself brought up about the fact that the lady was not allowed to respond, I just find that, I'm quite sure that the basic education policy will not go down that path, that bureaucratic idea. I don't know how many of you have heard Professor Krishna Kumar speak in Hindi. It's a delight. We've all heard him speak in English at the moment. It's a delight. So here is somebody, and there are many like this, who can speak in both languages. I suspect he thinks in both languages. I know for a fact that he writes in both languages. And the quality of his mind also, I think, has come from the fact that he was able to access so much in both languages. Not many of us had that luxury. of being able to access so much in both languages. And therefore, if your suggestion of Tibetan and English, I think that's a very good combination where the content and the language keep pace constantly. And therefore, the thought process, your ability to create new knowledge, which is the whole point of education in many ways, has to also be taken. It's not just being able to understand what the teacher is saying, but for you to internalize and then create for yourself some new stuff, whichever language you do that in. So I just wanted to say that, the access to both languages, the children will find, and we must not underestimate our children. That's a big mistake that we make, that we feel that they will not be able to cope with them. Most children rise to the level of expectation. And if you have very low expectations, then that's where they're going to remain. But at the same time, you should not raise your expectation to such a height that they break and snap with that tension that gets created. So, taking from what Professor Krishna Kumar said, that stretching and the expectation level of both the teacher. I mean, are you expecting too much from the teacher, or are you expecting too little from the teacher? Is the teacher expecting too much from the student? That balance will be needed to create a healthy environment in which, as he said, understanding and learning takes place. And the ability to access both languages is just so crucial.
For example, I never studied a language at school level or college level, that is Urdu. Of course, Hindi and English I was taught. I made efforts. But the home environment, the way the parents help by providing me the stories, books, the home environment made me learn Urdu. And I can say with reasonable degree of confidence that I speak and read and write good Urdu. What is the possibility of that in a typical Tibetan home here, that while they are going to school, but their home environment is providing this kind of an opportunity. And if this kind of an opportunity is possible, then I think we also need to capitalize on that. And just one word of caution, and not only relevant for this session, but I think for all the sessions, bureaucracy has certain compulsions. For example, with all these deliberations, I think at the end of this, and this being an advisory committee, perhaps the minister would be asking the bureaucrats, okay, what is the recommendation? What are the operative parts of that? Okay, how is it to be translated? So it is good that the secretary and the officers are present there. And then it's such a rich discussion taking place, but I think when we are writing and summarizing these discussions, so those operative definitions should be written as clearly as possible for the bureaucracy to understand and promote that cause. Otherwise, there is a danger, and I'm very sure that your bureaucracy is much more enlightened and informed and participant than our own bureaucracy. For example, with my experience in Planning Commission, Professor Krishna Kumar and Professor Yashpal's reports, Learning Without Burden. And then the minister asking the bureaucrats that, okay, what does it mean? Okay, we have accepted this report, this is to be translated. And then somebody reading this burden with the weight and saying that the total weight of the bag of the child should not be more than this much. That possibility always exists. So I think this committee should take a responsibility also, that summarizing these rich qualitative philosophical discussion, but then operative definition. And our most recent experience is the Yashpal committee report. The whole idea and the way it is being operationalized at the level of the bureaucracy. So this is just a word of caution encompassing all sessions.
Just one very quick...
just last quick one?
Yeah, quick one last. I think we need to do an experiment. When the students from 5th to 6th, there is a transition period. The students in the 6th class, 6th grade, when they are learning all the subjects in English, the science subjects and other social science and other things are, taught in English, they should be provided the same text in Tibetan also, because they are very much convenient in Tibetan language, so that these translated texts could be very assisting and very helpful for them. If this works, then we can provide the same material to the 7, 8 and 9 class grade students as well, which will help a lot for and then a time might come that they would learn, they might pay attention equally to both the textbooks, right? That will enhance their knowledge. And in the beginning, right away at 6th grade, if they are taught in English language, that would be certainly difficult. So if they have a parallel Tibetan text as well, in Tibetan language, then that will enhance their language and will enable them to understand the subject very much easily.
I think the word parallel text is very important. That even for the children's books that you might print for junior grades, some can be produced as parallel texts. There are several such things happening in Europe all over. Right side is in one language, left side the same lines are in the other language, and there's an illustration. And children pick up language very fast with such texts.
Oh, well, this session is coming very close to the end. Are based on certain assumptions about children